The first thing I remember about our early years together is how natural it all felt. College sweethearts, we slipped into life like two puzzle pieces that fit almost perfectly. When we got married, the world felt vast and full of possibility, but the small, quiet corners of our shared apartment became the real playground for our love. I would watch her make the bed in the morning, sunlight brushing her hair, and think, this is it, this is home. We talked about kids, back then, in casual, hopeful terms. 3 children, we joked, never thinking the journey would feel like walking on glass sometimes. Our oldest was born, and everything was blissful in its chaotic, sleepless way. She was radiant, even in exhaustion, and I was eager to help. Changing diapers, late-night feedings, midnight lullabies, I took my part seriously. I loved it. And for a while, I think she loved that about me. There was teamwork, laughter, and an unspoken understanding that we were in this together. The tension was non-existent. Parenting was a shared adventure, not a battlefield. Then the twins came. That's when the shift began, though at first it was subtle. She started asking me to run errands or tidy the house when I tried to feed the babies or spend quiet moments with our oldest. The requests weren't unreasonable in themselves, but the tone there was always this underlying sharpness, a sense that my involvement was an intrusion rather than a collaboration. I tried to rationalize it at first. Pregnancy and recovery are hard. She's just overwhelmed, I told myself. But the little comments piled up like weight on my shoulders. Every time I did something as small as feeding a baby, it was met with a look, a sharp word, or the insistence that I go make myself useful elsewhere. I remember one night clearly. It had been a long day, and I was trying to soothe the twins while keeping our oldest entertained. She was on a call with her sister, a conversation that stretched longer than I anticipated. So I made the executive decision to put our oldest to bed and get the twins fed. Simple, right? The next thing I knew, she was storming into the room, yelling at me. "Why are you doing this without me?" she demanded. I was stunned. I thought, she's on the phone. She's busy. I'm taking care of our children. But she wasn't hearing it that way. "That's not the point," she said. I asked her what the point was. She had no answer. Just that I should have waited, despite the obvious gap her attention had left. From that moment, it felt like I was always on edge, always waiting for the next reprimand, the next accusation. Every act of parenting, feeding, changing, playing felt like walking through a minefield. I began second-guessing every decision. Could I pick up one twin without being shouted at? Could I feed the other without being told I was doing it wrong? Should I even attempt bedtime, or would that spark a fight? I started calculating my actions, mentally running through her potential reactions before I even reached for a diaper. It wasn't just about small tasks, either. Weekends became minefields. I would suggest spending the day together, maybe taking all 3 kids to the park, or even a simple stroll around the block. She would either insist on taking one child and leaving me with errands, or keep the children glued to her side for the day. It was as if my presence with the kids was optional, even discouraged. The more I tried to engage, the more she seemed to retreat, leaving me to navigate parenthood like an outsider in my own home. The constant tension started to erode something fundamental, the joy of parenthood. I wasn't just frustrated at the rules she set or the restrictions she imposed. I was grieving the experience I had once cherished. I felt invisible in my own family, sidelined from moments I should have been sharing, and the twins. I feared they were learning early that I was secondary, that my love was optional, or worse, wrong. Even when I tried to address it, she would dismiss me. "It's all in your head," she said. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining anything. Every missed opportunity to hold a child, every curt dismissal when I offered to help, every fight about bedtime, feeding, errands, it was all there, tangible, leaving a mark on my confidence as a parent. The escalation wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like water dripping on stone, eroding the foundation beneath me. I started avoiding conflicts, not because I wanted to, but because I had learned that any attempt to assert myself was met with anger or exclusion. I would do things quietly, sneak moments with the kids when I could, but even then there was tension. I began to recognize patterns in our interactions, her claiming authority, me stepping back to avoid confrontation, the children caught in the middle. And yet, there were flashes of the old times, moments when I could still see the woman I fell in love with. A laugh shared over spilled milk, a soft glance when I passed by holding one of the twins, a fleeting touch as I tucked our oldest into bed. Those moments reminded me why I had committed to this life, why I had believed in partnership. But they were fleeting, scattered among countless instances of tension and disapproval, like trying to find warmth in a room that was slowly freezing over. I remember thinking about leaving during those early months of struggle, but something always held me back. The love for my children, the history we shared, the ideal of family it anchored me. I wanted to believe it was temporary, that once she adjusted to having 3 children, we could return to the rhythm we once had. But deep down, I feared we were past that point. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about my involvement. It was about control, about an unspoken power struggle over parenthood, and I was trapped on the losing side. Even ordinary activities became battlegrounds. Feeding, bathing, bedtime, grocery shopping, everything had the potential to spark conflict. I was accused of hogging the kids, even when I had been away all day for work. I was told to make myself useful, even as I tried to care for them. My intentions, my efforts, my love, it seemed, none of it mattered. Every interaction became a test. Would I survive the day without being yelled at? Would I find a way to connect with my children without triggering another fight? I tried reasoning, sitting her down calmly and explaining how this affected me, how it eroded my confidence and made me feel excluded. She dismissed it, insisting it was all in my mind. "You're imagining things," she said. I wanted to scream, to shake her and make her understand, but I knew that any escalation would likely backfire. I started to retreat, not because I wanted to, but because it felt safer. The very thing that should have been my joy, parenthood, had become a source of fear and frustration. Even now, I can recall the quiet desperation of those moments, the way I tiptoed through my own house, careful not to overstep, careful not to provoke, careful to maintain a fragile peace. I was still her husband, still the father of our children, but I was slowly learning that my role in our family was conditional, contingent on her approval. Every act of love had to be negotiated, every interaction scrutinized, and with each passing day, the sense of partnership I once cherished felt more like a distant memory. Slipping further away, the turning point in my mind wasn't a single incident, though there were many. It was the accumulation, the endless cycle of trying, failing, being rebuffed, and trying again. I realized that no matter how much I loved my children, no matter how hard I tried to contribute, I was navigating a minefield with no map. no guidance, and no guarantee of safety. And in that realization, a slow, steady frustration began to build, a sense that something fundamental was broken, something I could not simply fix with more effort or patience. I think the hardest part was watching the children. Our oldest, the twins, innocent, unaware, trusting me implicitly deserved a father who could fully participate in their lives without fear or hesitation. And I wanted to be that father. I wanted to be present, to engage, to nurture. But the barriers erected by my wife's behavior were relentless, and each day I saw those moments slipping away, replaced by tension, arguments, and missed opportunities. Even though it was early in the conflict, I felt the first stirrings of resentment, not toward the children, never toward them, but toward the circumstances, toward the unfairness of the dynamic that left me feeling powerless. And yet, I clung to hope, thinking that time, patience, and love could restore the balance. I had to hope. There was no other choice, but deep down, I feared we were heading into a long, painful struggle, one where love alone might not be enough to keep the family intact. I couldn't foresee the full scope of what was to come, but I could feel the shift, the undercurrent of tension that would only grow stronger, threatening the partnership and the harmony we once cherished. And that fear became a shadow over every smile, every laugh, every moment I tried to share with my children, a shadow that would follow me for years to come. After the initial shift in dynamics with the twins, life became a constant balancing act between love, duty, and self-preservation. I wanted to be a hands-on dad, to feed, hold, and play with our children, but it increasingly felt like every attempt to engage sparked conflict. The rules were invisible, yet rigid. Even small gestures, a diaper change, a feeding, putting a child to bed, were fraught with tension. I began timing my interactions, anticipating what she might say, planning how to avoid arguments, but no plan seemed sufficient. One morning, I suggested we spend the day as a family. The kids were excited, and I could see the sparkle in their eyes at the idea. But she refused. "I'll take care of the oldest, you handle the twins," she said, almost dismissively, and when I protested, she accused me of trying to control the schedule. I felt my voice caught somewhere between reason and frustration. I was trying to be present. I wanted to share joy with my children, but my efforts were seen as an affront, an overstep, a violation of some invisible boundary. I tried to explain, but explanations rarely worked. The fights escalated in subtle but relentless ways. When I took time off work, I intended to focus solely on our children, to immerse myself in their lives, but she would prepare for conflict, a readiness in her stance that made every interaction tense. And if I tried to avoid the fight, she found another way to assert control, keeping the children from me or subtly undermining my time with them. It became exhausting mentally, emotionally, and physically. I began to dread simple moments that should have been joyous, her insistence on keeping the children near her, on controlling every interaction extended beyond the home. Family gatherings, errands, even playdates became exercises in negotiation and anxiety. Once, I picked up the twins from her parents' house while she was at an appointment. I thought it was practical, a way to minimize disruption and maintain a routine. But she exploded, accusing me of overstepping, of not respecting her decision to leave them there. I tried to reason, but her response was rigid. "You're not respecting what I decided. I'm the mother. I know what's best." I wanted to shout, to make her see that I was equally capable, equally invested, but instead I swallowed my frustration, a bitter taste settling in my chest. Even gestures like baby wearing, which I found comforting for both myself and the children, became points of contention. I would cradle a twin in a carrier, walk around the living room, feel their tiny hands gripping my shirt, hear their soft sighs, and she would react with anger. "Put them down. Stop trying to take over," she would say. I remember feeling stunned. How could the simple act of loving my children provoke such hostility? I questioned myself constantly, wondering if I was doing something wrong, if my desire to connect was inappropriate, if my love was somehow criminal. There were moments that left me both relieved and shattered. When she was delayed in a call with her sister, I would step in, feeding, bathing, putting our oldest to bed. It felt like a small victory, a chance to assert my role without conflict. But as soon as she returned, the atmosphere would shift. I would be yelled at, accused of acting without permission, even if I followed every routine, every instruction to the letter. I learned that there was no winning. My presence could be framed as helpful or harmful depending on timing, tone, and her mood. The inconsistency gnawed at me. I reached a point where I began documenting interactions mentally, replaying incidents to understand triggers. Every decision, every movement, every attempt to be involved with our children had to be calculated. It was no longer just parenting. It was navigating a battlefield. I started to notice a pattern. Her reactions were less about the children and more about power, about control, about asserting authority over the moments that I hoped to share. My frustration morphed into anger, anger into sadness, sadness into resignation. The strain extended to the children. Our oldest would look to me for guidance, affection, validation, but I sometimes hesitated, fearing the fallout. The twins sensed tension too. Their smiles, their coos, their reaching hands became laced with anxiety as I tried to gauge whether an innocent gesture would ignite conflict. I wanted to protect them, shield them from the emotional turbulence, but there was only so much I could do. I realized that in trying to maintain peace, I was sacrificing my own involvement. And that realization hurt more than any argument. Hospitalization added another layer of complexity. When she was briefly admitted, I took days off work to care for the children. I thought this was my moment to step fully into the parenting role, to ensure stability while she recovered. But she reacted as though I was undermining her, insisting that I return to work and leave the children with her parents. Twice, she sent her parents to retrieve the kids from me, even though I had been their sole caregiver during her absence. I remember standing in the living room, holding one twin, the oldest clutching my leg, my heart racing, trying to reconcile love for my children with the impossibility of pleasing her. It was surreal watching my family turn into a tug-of-war over affection, care, and presence. When she returned home, I confronted her about the pattern. I tried to explain the frustration, the exhaustion, the emotional toll. I proposed therapy, a chance to work through these issues collaboratively. She refused outright. "Divorce. You would destroy our family," she screamed, her eyes wide, voice shaking with anger. She framed my desire for fairness and involvement as a threat, as selfishness, as an act of aggression. I was stunned. I didn't want divorce. I wanted partnership, balance, equity. But her refusal to even sit down and discuss solutions made it clear that the status quo was non-negotiable. The fights weren't just verbal. They seeped into our routines, our schedules, our plans. I began to notice that the children were absorbing the tension. The way they hesitated when I approached, the way they looked to her for permission, the way they sought comfort selectively eat, all reflected the invisible walls being built around their father. I felt helpless, watching the joy of my children being filtered through a lens of conflict I could not control. Even family advice offered no relief. My parents suggested compromise, patience, understanding, but I had tried all of that. Every attempt to negotiate or share responsibilities had been met with dismissal or hostility. Friends offered platitudes, but the reality at home was stark. I was a parent in title only, an observer in moments that should have belonged to me, a man gradually learning that love alone could not secure my place in my own family. Work and personal time blurred into a haze. I arrived home exhausted from long days, yet mentally drained from calculating every interaction. I started to sleep poorly, anxious about conflicts waiting around the corner. Weekends, which once held promise of family joy, now felt like countdowns to confrontation. Even simple outings were punctuated by a silent tension, an awareness that my involvement might be perceived as intrusion. The stress became cyclical, reinforcing itself. The more I feared conflict, the more I held back, and the more I held back, the more my wife asserted control. The emotional toll was cumulative. Anger, guilt, frustration, sadness, they interwove, creating a knot I couldn't untangle. I loved my children fiercely, but the environment made it difficult to express that love freely. I began to question my capacity to parent effectively under these constraints. Could I continue like this without damaging my relationship with my children? Could I endure the constant tension without losing myself? The questions haunted me in the quiet moments. When the children slept and the house was still, I replayed every interaction. I asked myself how it came to this, how love and partnership had eroded into negotiation and fear. I remembered the early days of teamwork and laughter, and the contrast made the present feel unbearable. The home I had once seen as a sanctuary had become a place of calculation, a stage for power struggles that had nothing to do with care and everything to do with control. And yet, despite it all, there were moments of connection, fleeting but vivid. A smile from our oldest, a soft touch from one of the twins, a quiet coo in my arms. Those moments reminded me why I persisted, why I tolerated the tension, why I hoped for reconciliation. They were fragile, like delicate glass, but they held meaning. They reminded me that the children needed their father, that I still had a role to play, however constrained it had become. The breaking point didn't arrive with a single explosion. It was a slow accumulation of frustration, fear, and exhaustion. By the time she recovered from her hospitalization, I had reached a moment of clarity. Something had to change. I couldn't continue navigating parenthood as if I were a guest in my own home, always waiting for permission to love, to nurture, to be present. The stakes were no longer just my emotional well-being. They were my children's, and the pattern we had settled into was unsustainable. I remember sitting in the living room one evening, the house quiet except for the soft breathing of our sleeping children. I felt a weight pressing down on my chest, a mixture of grief and resolve. I had tried everything: patience, negotiation, compromise, even silence. But nothing altered the dynamic. The moment I pushed for involvement, she resisted. The moment I held back, she undermined me in other ways. I realized that continuing like this wasn't love. It was survival, and survival alone wasn't enough for a family to thrive. I tried talking to her one last time. I chose my words carefully, emphasizing fairness, shared responsibility, and the well-being of our children. I offered therapy again, a neutral ground where we could unpack our struggles without the heat of daily confrontation. She refused. Her eyes blazed with anger, and her voice rose as she accused me of wanting to destroy the family, of jeopardizing our children's stability. It was as if my mere assertion of parental equality was an act of betrayal. I tried to reason, to show empathy, but the conversation spiraled into shouting, accusations, and ultimately silence. That's when the gravity of the situation settled in. The truth was unavoidable. We were no longer partners in parenting. Our interactions were governed by control, fear, and conflict. The children were caught in the crossfire, innocent observers of a war they didn't understand. And I realized that staying in this patternlessly negotiating, endlessly deflecting, endlessly compromising my own role was not protecting them. It was preserving dysfunction. I reached out to my parents for advice, hoping for guidance, a sounding board, a reminder of perspective. They were sympathetic, but they too urged compromise, patience, and understanding. Find a way to make it work, they said. I appreciated their concern, but their words also reminded me of the impossible balance I faced. To stay was to endure ongoing conflict. To leave was to face the unknown, the upheaval of separation, and the challenge of restructuring our children's lives. Either path carried consequences, but one path preserved dignity, sanity, and the chance to parent fully. The thought of divorce was painful. I loved my wife, or at least I loved the woman I had known, the one I had built a life with, the mother of my children. But love, I realized, cannot thrive in a vacuum of respect and cooperation. And as the months of conflict stretched on, it became increasingly clear that our relationship no longer contained either. The decision became less about desire and more about necessity. Everyday interactions had become a test of endurance. I would prepare meals, dress the children, manage their schedules, yet feel invisible or accuse. She would assert control in ways that left me isolated, marginalized, and frustrated. Even small victories, a bedtime story, a bath, a laugh, were fleeting, overshadowed by the constant undercurrent of tension. I began to understand that the problem was not my effort, not my commitment, not my love. It was the structure of our partnership itself. And that structure could not sustain us, not without catastrophic consequences for all involved. The children, of course, were at the center of my thoughts. Their innocence, their trust, their unconditional love were the anchors that kept me from leaving earlier, from walking away in frustration. But I also realized that staying in a toxic dynamic was teaching them patterns I didn't want them to internalize. Conflict over care, tension over affection, fear over love. I wanted them to experience parenting as it should be, balanced, loving, nurturing, and secure. And I knew that if the dynamic didn't change, they would only witness frustration and division. The hospital incident crystallized my understanding. While she was recovering, I took time off to care for the children fully. Yet she insisted I return to work and leave them with her parents. She even sent her parents to extract them from me twice. That was the moment I realized the stakes. I could no longer rely on mutual respect or shared understanding. I could no longer expect cooperation. My involvement, my love, my care were constantly challenged, dismissed, or undermined. The home, the family, the daily interactions, it had become a gauntlet. I began to strategize, to think through what a life of separation might look like. how I could maintain a strong relationship with my children while stepping away from a partnership that had become toxic. It wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about survival, clarity, and the preservation of a healthy environment for the kids. I needed to model stability, presence, and love without the interference of a conflict-laden dynamic in the quiet moments. I reflected on our early years, when parenting was a shared adventure and love felt effortless. I mourned the loss of that simplicity, the disappearance of mutual joy, and the erosion of partnership. But I also recognized that nostalgia could not dictate reality. We could not return to that time without cooperation, respect, and mutual engagement. She had made clear that these were not on the table. The decision crystallized as a responsibility. My role as a father. I could continue to endure conflict and risk resentment, or I could create a structure where I could parent fully, love openly, and maintain my own well-being. I realized that to prioritize the children's experience of love, care, and stability, I had to protect my own capacity to give those things, and that required decisive action. I approached her once more, calmly, firmly, and with clarity. I explained that the current pattern was untenable, that continuing as we were would harm all of us, and that we needed to consider separation for the well-being of the children and ourselves. She reacted with fury, fear, and denial, accusing me of selfishness, of breaking the family, of abandoning the children. And I understood then that my attempt at dialogue would not yield change. The walls were too high, the patterns too entrenched. I had to make a choice for the sake of my children and my own sanity. I began to envision a new rhythm, one in which I could actively parent, participate fully, and model love without constant conflict. It would require boundaries, legal and emotional safeguards, and a willingness to confront discomfort. It would also require patience, understanding, and empathy from all sides. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of agency. I was not powerless. I could act in the best interest of my children and myself. The months that followed were emotionally complex. There were moments of guilt, fear, and sadness, countered by moments of relief, clarity, and connection. I learned to navigate visits, parenting schedules, and daily routines with intention, ensuring that every interaction with my children was meaningful, positive, and free from conflict. I could hold them without fear, feed them without scrutiny, and play without interruption. The joy of parenting returned not in the absence of challenge, but in the deliberate creation of space for love and care. Through this process, I realized that family is not defined solely by cohabitation or marriage. Family is defined by the care, presence, and love that we bring to the children's lives. I learned that maintaining my role as a father required boundaries, courage, and difficult choices. It required stepping back from a partnership that no longer supported mutual growth. But most importantly, it required commitment to my children, to be fully present, fully engaged, and fully loving. I cannot erase the years of tension, the moments of conflict, or the feelings of marginalization. But I can create a future in which my children feel secure, loved, and nurtured by a father who is no longer sidelined. I have learned that love without respect is unsustainable. That partnership requires communication and mutual engagement, and that parenting is an act of courage, patience, and unwavering commitment. As I reflect on this journey, I am aware that the path forward will not be without challenges. There will be difficult conversations, logistical hurdles, and emotional complexities. But I also know that the foundation I am building with intentionality, care, and presences stronger than the daily conflicts that once defined our household. I am learning every day how to parent fully, how to love fully, and how to protect my children from patterns that do not serve them. Ultimately, this journey has taught me that the measure of a father is not just in presence, but in the quality of engagement, the depth of love, and the courage to create stability even in the face of chaos. The breaking point, painful as it was, became a turning point. I discovered that protecting my children and myself was not an act of abandonment, but an act of love, clarity, and hope for the future.